ASMR video here on the channel. Now, in today's video, as you can tell by the title, we have 1 hour of true crime stories. True crime ASMR videos are something I am a massive fan of, and I think they're quite popular within the ASMR sort of community and space. So I feel like they fit pretty well with the kind of videos we do here on the channel. So I figured now would be the perfect opportunity to introduce them to the channel. We've actually done one-off video before, the Real Wolf of Wall Street episode, but this is kind of marking the formal introduction of true crime to the channel. So today I will be whispering through 3 different true crime stories / people for you this evening. Now, for one of them, I will give a little bit of a trigger warning because it is a murderer, and obviously I'm not going to be focusing too much on the intimate grisly details, and it isn't just somebody who's gone around killing a load of people. There's like a really interesting twist to it, like a really interesting dynamic, and you'll see when we get to it. But I will timestamp all of the true crime stories down below, so in case you fall asleep, you want to find your place a bit more easily, then you can do so by going to the description. So without further ado, I reckon let's get straight into true crime story number 1. So number 1 is the Securitas depot robbery. Now this is the second largest robbery in the UK, I believe, and the one that's first really wasn't that interesting, so this is definitely the most interesting. The Securitas depot robbery was a large heist in Tonbridge, Kent, England. It began with a kidnapping on the evening of 21st of February 2006 and ended in the early hours of 22nd of February when the criminals left the depot with almost £53 million. It was the UK's largest cash robbery, and the gang left behind another £154 million because they did not have the means to transport it. After planning the heist for some time, doing surveillance and putting an inside man to work at the depot, the gang abducted the manager and his family. That night, they tricked their way inside the depot and tied up 14 workers, threatening them with weapons. The gang stole £52,996,760 in used and unused Bank of England sterling banknotes. Most of the getaway vehicles were found in the following week, one containing £1.3 million in stolen notes. In raids by Kent police, £9 million was recovered in Welling and £8 million in Southborough. By 2007, 36 people had been arrested in relation to the crime. At trial at the Old Bailey in London, 5 people were convicted and received long sentences, including the inside man Emir Heisenage. During the trial, a woman who had made prosthetic disguises for the gang decided to turn Queen's evidence in return for the charges against her being dropped. Lee Murray, the alleged mastermind of the heist, fled to Morocco with his friend and accomplice Paul Allen. He successfully fought extradition to the UK and was eventually imprisoned for the robbery there instead. Allen was extradited and jailed in the UK. Upon his release, he was shot and injured in 2019. As of 2016, £32 million had not been recovered, and several suspects were still on the run. So we're going to go into a little bit more detail how they were able to pull this off, beginning with looking at the depot itself. The Bank of England prints pound sterling banknotes in Epping Forest. In 2006, it was outsourcing the distribution of currency to 5 companies, namely the Group for Securitas, Halifax Bank of Scotland, Post Office Limited, Royal Bank of Scotland and Securitas. There were 28 centres across England and Wales, which both held new currency and stored used currency as it was returned, either to be redistributed or destroyed. Until 2001, Barclays had stored its own supplies of cash. The bank built the depot at Medway House, Vale Road, Tonbridge in Kent in 1980, choosing the location because it was close to 3 police stations that were always open. Medway House was just 330 yards away from the Tonbridge station and was also near to the Angel shopping centre. The first building on Vale Road was a quick-fit garage, and the second was the depot. Barclays had outsourced the distribution of money to Securitas Cash Management in 2001, and in 2006, Securitas was running the Tonbridge depot. It operated non-stop, with 80 full-time staff split across 3 shifts. Most of the work was sorting and counting banknotes, which arrived in armoured transport and was sent out again to restock cash machines. The cash was bundled up into bricks, which were wrapped in differently coloured plastic according to denomination. 5 £5 blocks were green, £10 bricks were blue, £20 notes were red, and £50 bricks were coloured yellow, and in a £50 brick there was £12,500. The manager of the depot was Colin Dixon. He lived in Herne Bay with his wife and their young child. Owing to the nature of the job, he had been trained not to tell his work colleagues where he lived and to drive to work every day using a different route. Since the family owned 2 cars, he would also alternate which car he used. He had been told that if he was ever stopped by the police when driving, he was supposed to stay in his car and give the officers a piece of paper describing his job, then follow them to the nearest station where he would cooperate with their enquiries. Moving into the next section, which is titled Conspiracy. A criminal gang began to study the depot with a view to robbing it. Men later convicted on conspiracy charges included Paul Allen, Chetmere Bookpapa, great name, Roger Goots, Emir Heisenage, Lee Murray, Stuart Royal, and Leah Russia. Albanians Bookpapa and Heisenage were childhood friends who had first met at school. They did not mention this in court, however, instead claiming not to know each other at all. Leah Russia, a roofer and cage fighter, met Bookpapa, who was a bouncer, at an MMA training session run by Russia at the Angel Centre, near to the depot. Russia also knew Lee Murray through MMA, and Murray was stopped by Kent police in July 2005 whilst in his car on a road overlooking the depot, together with 2 unidentified men. As well as being a cage fighter, Murray was a drug dealer. Emir Heisenage signed up with a recruitment agency which supplied workers to Medway House. He was first given a job at Royal Victoria Place shopping centre in Royal Tunbridge Wells, and then at the end of 2005 offered work at the depot. At his training, he asked questions about security measures and then passed the information to Bookpapa, who told Russia. On 6th of January 2006, mobile phone records displayed at trial indicated that Alan Goots, Murray, Royal and Russia were all present at a meeting at Royal's house. Murray visited a surveillance shop in Derbyshire to buy a spy camera and recording device, with the intention of giving it to Heisenage. Despite being warned by the shop owner to be careful not to get glue on the lens of the camera when placing it in position, someone from the gang did precisely just that. So Murray sent his friends Alan and Kane Patterson back to the shop to get it replaced. The shop owner fixed the camera and attached it to a belt. Then Heisenage used it to film inside the depot. On their way back down south, the men were stopped by Nottingham Nottinghamshire police for driving at 115 miles per hour. I mean, do you know how stupid that is? Like, if you're about to commit a crime, the last thing you want to do surely is draw any unnecessary attention to yourself. Not that I would. No. Moving on. Alan had broken the speed limit whilst driving on an expired provisional licence. Moreover, he was in a car he did not own, which had no MOT and no insurance, so just ticking all the boxes then. So it was impounded by the police. The gang's bad luck with cars continued when several days before the heist, Murray went clubbing in London and afterwards crashed his yellow Ferrari sports car on the New Kent Road in the morning. Murray fled the scene and was arrested by 4 police officers nearby. He was charged with assault in a case that never came to trial. More importantly, when he had abandoned his car, he left behind 2 burner phones with the numbers of other gang members saved and 3 photographs from the club, which showed him associating with Allen and Patterson. The police later recovered these items from the impounded car. On one of the phones, Murray had accidentally recorded himself talking to Russia about how to carry out the heist. I mean, these guys seem just straight idiotic, to be quite honest. Moving on to the robbery itself. So, in the early evening of Tuesday, the 21st of February 2006, Dixon was driving home along the A249 when he was pulled over just outside Stockbury, a village northeast of Maidstone, by what he presumed was an unmarked police car. The Volvo S60 had flashing blue lights in its grille, and one of the 2 uniformed officers came to Dixon's window, asking him to turn off his engine and leave the keys in the ignition. Breaching protocol, Dixon followed the officer's order to step out of the car and to sit in the police car. He was then handcuffed and his car was moved. The hostage-taking car travelled west on the M20 motorway to the West Malling bypass. At Mereworth, Dixon was threatened with a gun by the men, who he realised were criminals impersonating police officers. He was tied up and transferred into a white van which drove to Elderton Farm near Staplehurst. If any of my American viewers are watching have no idea where these places are, don't worry, I'm from England and I haven't heard of half of these names. The 2 men impersonating police officers next drove to Dixon's home in Herne Bay and spoke to Lynn Dixon, telling her that her husband had crashed his car and that she and her son should accompany them to the hospital as quickly as possible. It scares me that this could easily happen. When she got into the car, Lynn Dixon realised it was not a real police car, and the men told her she was being abducted. Well, that's nice of them to tell them. They just turned around from the front and they were like, "You are being abducted, congratulations." They took her to the farm as well. Dixon was then interrogated about the layout of the depot and warned at gunpoint that the lives of his family members depended on his actions. At around 1 o'clock in the morning on Wednesday 22nd of February 2006, 3 vehicles headed to the depot. Lynn Dixon and her son were held in the back of a 7.5-ton white Renault Midland lorry, with Colin Dixon and the other gang members travelling in a Vauxhall Vectra and the Volvo. The vehicles split up and the Volvo arrived at the depot at 1:21. Dixon and a gang member dressed as a police officer got out of the car and walked toward the pedestrian entrance. Dixon rang the bell and looked through the window at the control room operator. Instead of querying why Dixon was returning at night or why he was with an officer, the inexperienced operator opened the door and let the 2 men through the airlock and into the building. The whole heist was filmed on CCTV, and Kent police called the gang member dressed as a police officer policeman. Policeman was now able to subdue the operator, and without being asked, Dixon pressed the button which opened the gate and allowed the vehicles to enter the yard. Other gang members now entered the building. One was known as Stopwatch because he was wearing a stopwatch to time the robbery in an echo of the film Ocean's 11. Yeah, these guys have literally just watched a movie and gone, yeah, let's rob this place. Other gang members were called Shorty, Hoodie, and Mr. Average. I'd be fuming if you were nicknamed Mr. Average, wouldn't you? The criminals' faces were hidden by balaclavas, and they were armed with handguns, shotguns, AK-47 assault rifles, and a Scorpion submachine gun. With Dixon urging staff to comply with the commands of the gang, a total of 14 workers were tied up. Nobody pressed an alarm. The 7 members of the gang began to fill the lorry with money, experiencing difficulties due to the weight of the full cages. They asked a staff worker to drive the powerlifter, but he kept on crashing it on purpose. What a ledge. So they switched to using a pallet mover as well. The worker then wedged the powerlifter between the tail lift of the truck and the loading bay, rendering it useless. What a hero. The criminals filled the lorry with £53 million in used and unused banknotes. Another £154 million were not fit in the lorry and had to be left behind when the gang departed. They had stolen 17 cages and 3 supermarket trolleys full of banknotes. The staff workers were left locked into empty cash cages, as were Lynn Dixon and her son. No alarm had been set off, and the gang ordered the staff to stay still when they left at 2:44. At 3:15, when they were sure the robbers had gone, staff triggered an alarm which called the police. The hostages were all shaken. The police arrived and began the investigation by interviewing the staff and taking their clothes and their DNA profiles. And then this last section is titled Investigation and Arrests. The following day, Securitas and their insurers offered a reward of £2 million for any information about the heist, which Crime Stoppers stated was the largest reward ever offered in the UK. Securitas gave the Bank of England £25 million as an initial reimbursement. Kent police said the heist had been meticulously planned by organised crime and that at least £20 million had been stolen, possibly as much as £50 million. By the evening of 23rd of February, 2 arrests had been made in South London. A man aged 29 and a woman aged 31 were detained at separate houses on suspicion of conspiracy to commit robbery. A third person, a 41-year-old woman, was arrested at a branch of the Portman Building Society in Bromley on suspicion of handling stolen goods. This woman was completely innocent, and she told The Guardian she was planning to sue the police on account of the most distressing experience of my life. That's what she quoted. As news of the robbery reached the newspapers, Heisenage was told he had the day off work and went to see the Levellers at the Assembly Hall Theatre with his girlfriend. The same day, the police discovered some of the vehicles implicated in the robbery. A former parcel force van had been left at the Hook and Hatchet pub in Hucking. A Volvo and a Vauxhall Vectra had been abandoned near Leeds Castle. Dixon's Nissan Almiron was located at the Cock Horse pub in Detling. The next day, discarded metal cages and other paraphernalia from the crime scene were found at Fringham Farm near Detling, on land rented by a friend of the owner of Elderden Farm. A white Ford Transit van owned by a friend of Book Papa and Russia was reported to be in the car park of the Ashford International Hotel. When the police checked the van, they found a balaclava, a bulletproof vest, and the Scorpion submachine gun. 2 bags were opened which contained over 1.3 million in stolen banknotes. On Saturday, armed police officers raided the homes of Book Papa and Russia, encountering Book Papa's wife at their house on Hadlow Road. At Russia's house, police found surveillance footage of Dixon's home, weapons and plans of the depot. In the shed they discovered more balaclavas, Royal Mail clothing and a radio scanner turned to a frequency used by the emergency services. Oh, I take it back about them being idiots. They really did know what they were doing, didn't they? On Sunday afternoon, Kent police arrested Stuart Royal and another man after shooting out a tyre of the BMW car he was driving. On Monday, police arrested Book Papa and Russia in Deptford, London, after shooting out the tyres of their car. The following day, the white 7.5-ton lorry which had transported the loot was located at a hire centre. At the farm, £30,000 in stolen notes was found in the boot of a car, and £105,000 hidden under a dead tree in the orchard. 4 days after the heist, Murray and Alan fled the UK. After visiting Amsterdam, they travelled to Morocco, where they spent money extravagantly on houses, jewellery and narcotics. Back in the UK, police officers raided a unit on the Graves Industrial Estate in Welling on 2nd of March. They broke open a shipping container, finding an estimated £7 million in cash. They also found 50 grand in a bin bag elsewhere, so these guys just dumped the money anywhere and everywhere, didn't they? Well, there we go. By the year's end, Kent police had recovered £21 million and had asked the Home Office for at least £6 million to cover both investigating the case and future spending on trial preparations. By 2007, a total of 36 people had been arrested. So, as I said, this is, I believe, the second largest ever bank heist in the UK's history, but the first one was, the one that was number one, was really quite boring. It was literally just millions of bonds were stolen, but there wasn't much of a story. There was just a guy walking with a briefcase full of bonds, and they just jumped him and took it. Whereas this was a bit more planned and stuff, but definitely very interesting. But for the next one, we're going to hop over to America to take a look at a man called John Dillinger. So, who was John Dillinger? John Dillinger was born on June 22nd, 1903 in Indianapolis, Indiana. As a boy, he committed petty theft. In 1924, he robbed a grocery store and was caught and jailed. He escaped, and he and his gang headed to Chicago, Illinois, to put together one of the most organised and deadly bank robbing groups in the country. The group continued on a crime spree in various states until they were arrested, with Dillinger eluding authorities for months and receiving major media attention. In 1934, Dillinger was shot and killed in a setup by the FBI outside of a movie theatre in Chicago. So that's a summary of who he is. Let's skip back and take a look at his early life. John Herbert Dillinger was born on June 22nd, 1903 in Indianapolis, Indiana. As a child, he went by Johnny. As an adult, he was known as Jack Rabbit for his graceful moves and quick getaways from the police. And as a public figure, he was declared the United States' first public enemy #1. His exploits during the Great Depression made him a headline news celebrity, as well as one of the most feared gangsters of the 20th century. As a boy, Dillinger committed small-time pranks and petty theft with his neighbourhood gang, the Dirty Dozen. Many of his neighbours would later say he was a generally pleasant kid who didn't seem to get into any more mischief than his peers. But there were also accounts of juvenile delinquency and malicious behaviour as a teen. To a degree, both of these perceptions can be seen as correct and were evident in his adult life. Like any celebrity, accounts describing his early life were overshadowed by his later exploits, and many of the circulating stories on Dillinger have become that of legend. Dillinger was the youngest of 2 children, born to John Wilson Dillinger and Mary Eleanor Ellen Lancaster. The elder Dillinger was a sombre churchgoer who owned a neighbourhood grocery store and some rental houses. He was an abusive boss at times who would hit his son for perceived insubordination and then giving money for treats. Dillinger's mother died of a stroke when he was just 3 years old. His sister Audrey, who was significantly older, raised him until her own marriage a year later, with John Sr. remarrying in 1912. Dillinger quit school at age 16, not due to any trouble, but because he was bored and wanted to make money on his own. He was said to have a talent for working with his hands, and was a good employee at an Indianapolis machine shop. In 1920, hoping a change of venue would provide a more wholesome influence on his son, John Sr. sold his grocery store and property to retire to a farm in Mooresville, Indiana. Ever defiant, John Jr. kept his job at the Indianapolis machine shop and made the commute there via his motorcycle. So, now moving into his early crimes and convictions. Having been involved in illicit nighttime activity during his work trips, matters reached a head on July 21st, 1923, when a young Dillinger stole a sedan outside of a church, perhaps reacting to a failed romantic relationship. He was later found roaming aimlessly through Indianapolis streets by 2 police officers who, after questioning Dillinger and becoming suspicious of his vague explanations, placed him under arrest. Dillinger managed to slip loose from the officers, however, and ran. Knowing that he couldn't go back home, he joined the United States Navy the very next day. While Dillinger made it through basic training, he quickly realised that the regimented life of military service was definitely not for him. While assigned to the USS Utah, the same USS Utah that was sunk at Pearl Harbor in 1941, he jumped ship, ending his 5-month military career. He was eventually dishonourably discharged. Upon his return to Mooresville in April 1924, Dillinger met and married teenager Beryl Ethel Ovius in nearby Martinsville, and he attempted to settle down. With no job or income, the newlyweds stayed both at the Dillinger farmhouse and the home of Ovius's parents. Dillinger eventually got a job in an upholstery shop. During the summer of 1924, Dillinger played shortstop on the Martinsville baseball team, where he met and befriended Edgar Singleton. He told Dillinger about a local grocer who would be carrying his daily receipts on his way from work to the barber shop. The plan was that Dillinger could easily rob the elderly grocer for the cash he would be carrying, while Singleton waited in a getaway car down the street. Dillinger was allegedly armed with a .32 caliber pistol and a large bolt wrapped in a handkerchief, with some conflicting reports on whether he or Singleton initiated the attack. Dillinger is said to have come up behind the grocer and clubbed him with the bolt, but the grocer turned and grabbed his attacker and the gun, forcing it to discharge. Believing that he had shot the grocer, Dillinger took off running down the street towards Singleton's getaway car. Singleton wasn't there, however, and Dillinger was soon caught by the police. The local prosecutor convinced Dillinger's father that if his son pleaded guilty to the armed robbery charges, the court would be lenient. That was the extent of his legal assistance, however. Dillinger appeared in court without a lawyer and without his father, and the court threw the book at him. He was sentenced to 10 to 20 years in prison, even though it was his first conviction. Singleton, who had a prison record, was also caught, but would serve less than 2 years of his 2 to 14-year sentence due to legal representation. The next section is titled "Imprisonment imprisonment at Indiana State Reformatory. Dillinger was imprisoned at the Indiana State Reformatory in Pendleton, playing on the institution's baseball team and doing seamster work. Dillinger's remarkable skill with his hands came into play just as it had during his time at the machine shop. He frequently completed twice his quota in the prison factory, and secretly helped fill other men's quotas. As a result, he gained an array of friends and allies, including Harry Pierpont and Homer Van Meter, two men who would eventually join Dillinger in his life of crime. Dillinger's wife and family initially visited him frequently. He often penned correspondences to Beryl full of romantic sentiment, with letters like, "Dearest, we will be so happy when I can come home to you and chase your sorrows away. For sweetheart, I love you so, all I want is to just be with you and make you happy." But Beryl was not doing so well with the separation. She officially divorced Dillinger on June 20th, 1929, 2 days before his birthday. Wow, how cold. He was distraught, don't blame him, later admitting that the split had left him crestfallen. That same year, Dillinger was denied parole, becoming consumed by bitterness. In a letter he later wrote to his father in October 33, after several robberies, he confided, "I know I have been a big disappointment to you, but I guess I did do much time, for where I went in a carefree boy, I came out bitter toward everything in general. If I had gotten off more leniently when I made my first mistake, this would never have happened." Dillinger asked to be sent to Indiana State Prison in Michigan City, Indiana. He told prison officials that he wanted to be transferred because the Michigan City prison had a better baseball team, but in actuality, he wanted to rejoin Pierpont and Van Meter, who'd been transferred there earlier. Dillinger found prison life in Michigan City much more rigid, and his spirits became increasingly low. He didn't join the baseball team, but instead buried himself in shirt factory labour. It was during this time that Dillinger learned the ropes of crime from seasoned bank robbers. In addition to reconnecting with Pierpont and Van Meter, he became friends with Walter Dietrich, who had worked with the notorious Hermann Lahm. Previously part of the German military, Lahm had moved to America and was known for planning his bank robberies with a high degree of precision and strategic thought. Dietrich had studied the man's method well and instructed others on how to investigate the layout of a bank and surrounding establishments. Moving on to jailbreaks. Pierpont and Van Meter had longer sentences than Dillinger, but they weren't planning on serving their full terms and had already begun planning bank heists for when they were out. Upon leaving prison, they would bribe a few key guards, get a few guns and grab a place to lay low for a while. But they would need money to finance their jailbreak. Knowing that Dillinger would be freed the soonest, Pierpont and his colleagues brought him in on their scheme. In May 1933, the plan got an unexpected boost. Dillinger, who by this time had been in the state pen for almost 4 years, was notified by his family that his stepmother was near death. He was granted parole, but she died shortly before his return home. Seizing the moment, Dillinger joined a few of Pierpont's men and began a string of robberies. With the aid of 2 female accomplices, Pearl Elliott and Mary Kinder, Dillinger put the escape plan in motion. He arranged for several guns to be placed in a box of thread and smuggled the package into the shirt factory. The prison break was set for late September. Having some time on his hands, Dillinger decided to visit a lady friend he'd met earlier that year, Mary Longacre, in Ohio. Unfortunately for them, the police were following him as he gathered funds for the prison break. After receiving a tip from a landlady, they stormed into Longacre's room and arrested Dillinger. He was sent to Allen County Jail in Lima, Ohio. In the meantime, Pierpont and his men escaped from Indiana State and made their way to a hideout in Hamilton, Ohio. Dillinger was incarcerated under the care of Sheriff Jess Saber and his wife, who lived at the Lima facility. The jail was about 100 miles away from Pierpont's hideout, and Pierpont soon realised that with some cash and a few guns, he would be able to spring Dillinger. Pierpont and 2 other men knocked over a local bank, and later, armed with pistols, the 3 men approached the jailhouse just as Sheriff Saber and his wife were finishing dinner. Pierpont knocked on the door and announced that they were officials from the state penitentiary and needed to see Dillinger. When Saber asked for their credentials, they showed him their guns. When Saber reached for his weapon, Pierpont panicked and shot him, later clubbing the downed officer as well. Mrs. Saber then gave the men the jail keys and they sprang Dillinger. Saber did die a few hours later, making all members of the gang accessories to murder. Once Dillinger was free, the gang headed to Chicago to put together one of the most organised and deadly bank robbing gangs in the country. To pull many of the big jobs they had planned, Pierpont and Dillinger knew they needed heavy firepower, ammunition and bulletproof vests. To get this equipment, they headed to the police arsenal in Peru, Indiana. After casing the joint, Pierpont and Dillinger entered the arsenal, overpowered personnel and stole a variety of weapons. The next section is titled The Dillinger Gang. After the bold prison escape and bank heist, the killing of Saber and the attack on the police arsenal, the Pierpont gang was gaining substantial notoriety. I can never say that word. Newspapers wrote sensational stories of the group's exploits. Members were described as shadowy figures, wearing dark overcoats with hat brims pulled down to hide their identities. The thieves would make swift movements and bark out sharp, crisp orders to get down and nobody gets hurt. Victims were described as helpless and grateful to have their lives spared, and the law was portrayed as inept. All the gang members were well aware of their publicity, particularly Dillinger, who read the stories and saved press clippings. While most men in their line of work possessed big egos, there seemed to be little struggle for leadership within the gang. Whether the newspapers made reference to the Pierpont gang or the Dillinger gang didn't seem to make much difference. Each man had a role to play, and the planning of robberies was more egalitarian, with all members providing input. When they weren't working, the men lived quietly and conservatively in expensive Chicago apartments. They dressed like any other respectable businessmen and didn't draw much attention to themselves. Nearly all members had girlfriends, some had wives, but the attachments were episodic. The men drank only on off hours, typically beer. Pierpont had a strict rule that planning and committing a crime had to be done without alcohol or drugs. For the most part, all members agreed that if any gang members couldn't or wouldn't adhere to the rules, they were let go. From late 1933 into next year, the gang committed several Midwest bank robberies. Always meticulously planned, the heists often had a theatrical flair. It was rumoured that once several gang members posed as alarm system sales reps to get into a bank's vault and have access to the security system. Another time, they allegedly pretended to be a film crew scouting locations for a bank robbery movie. It was during this period that stories began to circulate in newspapers of interesting oddities and even humorous incidences that occurred during the bank robberies, all enhancing the thieves' reputations. Despite stories of Dillinger being a Robin Hood type and a glamorization of the gangster persona, the FBI later countered that he and his cohorts were dangerous gunmen, primarily looking to line their own pockets. In December 1933, the gang decided to take a break in Florida. They'd had a much-done holiday, of course. Shortly before they left, one of the gang members fatally shot a police officer while picking up a car at a repair shop. The Chicago Police Department established an elite group of officers dubbed the Dillinger Squad. The gang spent the holidays in Florida, and shortly after New Year's, Pierpont decided they should head for Arizona. On his way out west, Dillinger collected his girlfriend Billy Frechette and one other gang member, Red Hamilton. He and Hamilton decided to rob a First National Bank in East Chicago for some quick cash to fund their trip. As you do, just rob a bank quickly. The robbery went badly. Hamilton was wounded, and Dillinger allegedly killed police officer William Patrick O'Malley during their escape. Other members of the gang arrived in Tucson and were experiencing difficulties of their own. A fire at the hotel where they were staying tipped off police to their whereabouts. Dillinger and Frechette arrived a day or so after the fire and registered at a nearby motel. The next day, Tucson police rounded up all members of the group, including Dillinger and Frechette, in a few hours. Over the ensuing days, officials from the Midwest bartered for the extradition of the prisoners, with each state representative claiming supreme jurisdiction. In time, matters were sorted out, and various gang members were assigned to different locales for trial. Dillinger wants to go back to Indiana with Police Captain Matt Leach to stand trial for the murder of O'Malley. This next section is titled The New Dillinger Gang. Dillinger was taken to the office of Lake County Sheriff Lillian Holly, who was serving out the term of her late husband who'd been killed in the line of duty. The sheriff's office had become command central as reporters and photographers jammed into the cramped room to get a picture and quick quote from the famed desperado. At one point, a photographer asked Dillinger to pose with law enforcement officials. Nice. He obliged and placed his elbow on the shoulder of Indiana State Prosecutor Robert S. Still. The highly controversial picture was printed in many newspapers. I'll put it on screen if I can find it, with Still eventually losing his job for taking an image that evoked camaraderie with such a notorious figure. That is jokes. I really want to see the picture. While awaiting trial, Dillinger was placed in Crown Point Prison, a facility that was deemed inescapable. On the 3rd of March 1934, Dillinger proved them wrong by slipping out of the prison on his own without a shot fired. Legend has it that Dillinger carved a wooden gun, blackened it with shoe polish, and used it to escape. Other accounts speak of corruption from within the facility and that someone slipped him a real gun, with yet another theory being that Dillinger's attorney, Louis Piquet, bribed prison staff. In any case, Dillinger was able to elude his captors, steal Sheriff Holly's police car, and make his getaway back to Illinois. But in the process, he crossed state lines with a stolen car, which is a felony, and drew the attention of the FBI, headed by J. Edgar Hoover. Once arriving in Chicago, Dillinger quickly put together another gang. This guy just doesn't stop, does he? In this iteration, members weren't as carefully chosen as the previous gang, being composed of a few misfits and psychopaths, including Lester Gillis, also known as Babyface Nelson. Dillinger also teamed up with his friend from the reformatory, Homer Van Meter. The new gang relocated to the St. Paul, Minnesota area. During the month of March, the Dillinger gang went on a crime spree, robbing several banks. Yet law enforcement continued to be hot on the group's trail, as Dillinger and Frechette barely escaped the FBI while staying at an apartment building in St. Paul. With Frechette taken into custody after returning to Chicago, Dillinger and some of his men were forced to hole up in a Wisconsin hideout called Little Bohemia. Soon after their arrival, the lodge owner, Emil Wanatka, recognised his new guest as the famous Dillinger. Dillinger assured Winnetka that there wouldn't be any trouble. However, because the gang's other members made Winnetka fear for his family's safety, he wrote a letter to U.S. Attorney George Fisher revealing the identity of his guests. Winnetka's wife, Nan, great name, Nan, convinced Dillinger to let her go to her nephew's birthday party. She was able to bypass babyface Nelson, who was following them, and mail the letter. Soon after, Melvin Purvis, the local FBI agent, was contacted. On April 22nd, 1934, agents drove to the Little Bohemia Lodge, about 2 miles from the resort. They turned off their car lights and trekked on foot into the woods. The agents were attacked by gunfire upon approaching the lodge, and Nelson took hostages in a separate location. Ultimately, the gang members once again made a getaway. An FBI agent and a civilian were killed in the melee, with additional men wounded. And here we go, the public enemy number 1. By the summer of 1934, Dillinger had dropped out of sight. Because of his notoriety, life had become increasingly difficult. On his birthday, the FBI labelled him America's first ever public enemy number 1 and placed a $10,000 reward on his head. To avoid detection, along with Van Meter, Dillinger had undergone a crude facelift in May at the abode of mob-affiliated Jimmy Probasco. Dillinger spent the following month at Probasco's Chicago home, healing from the surgery and using the alias Jimmy Lawrence, the real name of a petty thief who had once dated Frechette as well. Because that's a good idea, use the name of another criminal. Surely I can't go wrong. On June 30th, 1934, Dillinger robbed his last bank. How sad. He was accompanied by Van Meter, Nelson, and one other unidentified individual. Shortly before noon, the gang arrived at the Merchants National Bank in South Bend, Indiana. In the resulting robbery, police officer Howard Wagner was shot and killed. A shop owner brandishing a pistol shot Nelson as he came out of the bank, but the bulletproof vest he was wearing saved him. Civilians, along with Van Meter, were wounded in yet another terribly violent exchange. The crew's stolen funds totaled around $30,000. It's not known for sure how Dillinger met Anna Sage, also known as Anna Campanis. Some stories say their relationship went back several years. Others say they met in 1934 by his girlfriend Polly Hamilton, who worked for Sage. Sage was born in Romania and moved to America with her husband, settling in East Chicago, Indiana. Soon after the birth of her son, her marriage ended and she supported herself as a prostitute for mobster Big Bill Superdick. Later, after his death, she took over the business and worked as a madam, opening up additional brothels. For a time, she was under investigation by the Immigration and Naturalization Service and facing deportation. At some point, she had become involved with one of the city's detectives, Martin Zarkovich, either as a friend or love interest. After Sage told Zarkovich of her problems with the INS, he arranged a meeting with Agent Purvis. Purvis and Sage met on July 19th, 1934, with Sage hoping that Purvis would be able to make a difference in her potential deportation in exchange for help in nabbing Dillinger. With Sage as an informant, Purvis assembled a team of FBI agents and hired guns from police forces outside the area because he felt that Chicago authorities had been compromised and couldn't be trusted. And that brings us on to final moments and death. On Sunday, July 22nd, 1934, Anna Sage told FBI agents in a hushed voice that she and Dillinger were planning to go to either the Biograph or Marlborough theatres to see a film. Purvis decided to stay at the Biograph himself. 2 other agents were posted to the Marlborough. Purvis was standing just a few feet away from the theatre entrance when the Clark Gable movie Manhattan Melodrama let out. As Dillinger passed, he looked Purvis directly in the eyes but made no indication of recognition or suspicion. Following the prearranged signal, Purvis lit a cigar. As Dillinger, his girlfriend Polly Hamilton, and Sage walked down the street, an anxious Purvis quickly pulled out his gun and yelled, "Stick 'em up, Johnny, we have you surrounded." Dillinger began to run, reaching into his pants pocket to draw a gun. He entered an alley just as a volley of gunfire greeted him. The fatal shot entered the base of Dillinger's neck and travelled upward, hitting the second vertebrae before exiting below his right eye. Delicious. Gradually a crowd formed around Dillinger's lifeless body, with several people dabbing handkerchiefs into his blood for souvenirs. What the... Dabbing is probably better than that. That is ridiculous. I wonder how much that would sell on eBay though now. The police had to finally be called in to move people away so that federal agents could secure the scene and remove Dillinger's body. This now lists all the different movies. It was Public Enemies about him then, yeah, which stars Johnny Depp as Dillinger. I don't think I've actually ever seen that. Maybe I'll give it a watch. But yeah, this guy, pretty crazy, right? One of America's most notorious bank robbers, and I mean, this didn't really speak too much about it. It mentioned it in passing, but he had like a reputation of stealing from like rich banks and giving it to poor people. But this didn't really seem to suggest that, because that was basically what I thought he did. But turns out no, he killed people and robbed a lot of places. So, anyways, to finish off, we have a slightly shorter true crime story. Now this is the one about the murder, but I think you're going to want to stick around for this one. This article is titled "Evil Born: The Vicious Crimes of 11-year-old Murderer Mary Bell." Strap in, guys. Mary Bell was only 10 years old when she committed her first murder, and it wasn't her last. It's like a horror story. Mary Bell killed 2 young boys in 1968. When she was released from prison after serving a 12-year sentence, she was only 23 years old. In other words, Mary Bell was only 10 when she started committing her murders. But her experiences of violence didn't begin there. Pain and death were companions almost from the moment of her birth. Mary Bell was born on May 26, 1957, to Betty, a 16-year-old prostitute who reportedly told doctors to take that thing away from me when she saw her daughter. I mean, that's just mean. I'm pretty sure that was my mum's reaction when she saw my brother. Anyway, things went downhill from there. Betty was often away from home on business trips to Glasgow, but her absences were periods of respite for the young Mary, who was subject to abuse, both mental and physical, when her mother was present. Betty's own sister, witness Betty, tried to give Mary away to a woman who had been unsuccessfully trying to adopt. The sister quickly recovered Mary herself. Mary was also strangely accident-prone. She once fell from a window and on another occasion accidentally overdosed on sleeping pills. Oh my gosh, this is actually really sad. Some attribute the accidents to Betty's determination to rid herself of an encumbrance, while others see the symptoms of Munchausen syndrome by proxy. Betty longed for the attention and sympathy her daughter's accidents brought her. I mean, that's sick as well. According to later accounts given by Mary herself, her mother began to prostitute her out when she was just 4 years old, though this remains uncorroborated by family members. They did not know, however, that Mary's young life had already been marked by loss. She had seen her 5-year-old friend run over and killed by a bus. Given all that had happened, it did not surprise them that Mary, by the age of 10, had become a strange child, withdrawn and manipulative, always hovering on the edge of violence. there was a lot they didn't know. For weeks before her first murder, Mary Bell had been acting strangely. On the 11th of May 1968, Mary had been playing with a 3-year-old boy when he was badly injured in a fall from the top of an air raid shelter. His parents thought it was an accident. The following day, however, 3 mothers came forward to tell police that Mary had attempted to choke their young daughters. A brief police interview and a lecture resulted, but no charges were filed. Then, on May 25th, the day before she turned 11, Mary Bell strangled 4-year-old Martin Brown to death in an abandoned house in Scotswood, England. How on earth did she get a 4-year-old to an abandoned house? She left the scene and returned with her friend Norma Bell to find they'd been beaten there by 2 local boys who had been playing in the house and stumbled on the body. Police were mystified. Besides a little blood and saliva on the victim's face, there were no obvious signs of violence. There was, however, an empty bottle of painkillers on the floor near the body. In the absence of better information, they assumed Martin Brown had swallowed the pills. His death was ruled an accident. But Martin's grieving family might have started to suspect otherwise when little Mary Bell showed up on their doorstep in the days after Martin's death and asked to see him. His mother gently explained to her that Martin was dead, but Mary said she already knew that. She wanted to see his body in the coffin. Martin's mother slammed the door in her face. This is like a horror story. Feel free to click off if you're not finding this too relaxing. I know some people probably won't, but I just think it's super tragic but super interesting. Shortly after, Mary and her friend Norma broke into a nursery school and vandalised it with notes, taking responsibility for Martin Brown's death and promising to kill again. Police assumed the notes were a morbid prank. For the nursery school, this was just the latest and most disturbing in a series of break-ins. They warily installed an alarm system. It was a smart choice because it caught Mary and Norma at the scene of the crime several nights later, but as they were simply loitering outside when the police arrived, they were let off the hook. In the meantime, Mary was telling her fellow classmates that she had killed Martin Brown. Her reputation as a show-off and a liar prevented anyone from taking her claim seriously. That is, until another young boy turned up dead. On July 31st, 2 months after the first murder, Mary Bell and her friend Norma killed 3-year-old Brian Howe by strangulation. This time... Oh gosh, okay, yeah, I'm not gonna read that, because that's... yeah, it's a bit too graphic. When Brian's sister went looking for him, Mary and Norma offered to help. They searched the neighbourhood, and Mary even pointed out the concrete blocks that hid the body, but Norma said he wouldn't be there, and Brian's sister moved on. This girl is sick, isn't she? Oh my gosh. When Brian's body was finally found, the neighbourhood was panicked. 2 boys were dead in as many months. Police interviewed local children, hoping someone had seen something that would lead to a suspect. They received a shock when the coroner's report came back. As Brian's blood had cooled, new marks appeared on his chest. Someone had used a razor blade to scratch the letter M onto his torso. And there was another disturbing note. The lack of force used in the attack suggested Brian's killer might have been a child. Mary and Norma did a poor job of disguising their interest in the investigation in their interviews with the police. Both acted strangely. Norma was excited and Mary evasive, especially when police pointed out that she had been seen with Brian Howe on the day of his death. On the day of Brian's burial, Mary was spotted lurking outside his house. She even laughed and rubbed her hands together when she saw the coffin. They called her back for a second interview, and Mary, perhaps sensing investigators were closing in, made up a story about having seen an 8-year-old boy hit Brian on the day he died. The boy, she said, had been carrying a pair of broken scissors. That was Mary Bell's big mistake. The mutilation of the body with scissors had been kept from the press and the public. It was a detail known only to investigators and one other person, Brian's murderer. Both Norma and Mary broke down under further questioning. Norma began cooperating with police and implicated Mary, who herself admitted to being present during Brinehouse murder, but tried to place the blame on Norma. Both girls were charged and a trial date was set. At trial, the prosecutor told the court that Belle's reason for committing the murders was solely for the pleasure and excitement of killing. Meanwhile, the British press referred to her as evil-born. The jury agreed that Mary Belle had committed the murders and handed down a guilty verdict in December. Manslaughter, not murder, was the conviction, as court psychiatrists had convinced the jury that Mary Belle showed classic symptoms of psychopathy and could not be held fully responsible for her actions. I think that's probably fair enough. Norma Belle was regarded as an unwilling accomplice who had fallen under a bad influence, and she was acquitted. Wow. The judge concluded that Mary was a dangerous person and a serious threat to other children. She was sentenced to be imprisoned at Her Majesty's pleasure, a British legal term that denotes an indeterminate sentence, basically until the powers that be feel like it's appropriate to let you out. Apparently, the powers that be were impressed with Belle's treatment and rehabilitation and felt like it was appropriate to let her out in 1980. She was released on licence, which meant that she was technically still serving her sentence but was able to do so while living in the community under strict probation. Additionally, Mary Belle was given a new identity to provide her with a chance at a new life and protect her from tabloid attention. Even still, she was forced to move several times to escape hounding by tabloids, newspapers, and the general public, which somehow always found ways of tracking her down. Things grew worse for Belle after she had her daughter in 1984. Belle's daughter didn't know about her mother's crimes until she was 14, when a tabloid paper was able to find Belle's common-law husband and thus track Belle down. Soon, a slew of journalists surrounded her house and camped out in front of it. The family had to escape their home with bedsheets over their heads. Today, Belle is in protective custody at a secret address. Both she and her daughter remain anonymous and are protected under court order. Some feel she doesn't deserve the protection. June Richardson, the mother of Martin Brown, told the media, "It's all about her and how she has to be protected. As victims, we are not given the same rights as killers." Nevertheless, Mary Belle remains protected by the British government today, and court rulings protecting the identities of certain convicts are even unofficially referred to as Mary Belle orders. Well, that was the John Dillinger one. Was sort of like a bit more of an upbeat crime story, but that was just kind of, kind of quite disturbing. Firstly, those poor children who were murdered, but sort of like what the psychiatrist said, you can't even hold Mary fully accountable for her actions because she herself had such a horrific upbringing and went through such trauma that it just messed her up completely. But I just saw that headline and thought that was a pretty interesting true crime story and it should be included. But guys, that is gonna do it for this video. I feel like I've been recording for absolutely ages. I think it has been well over an hour. My leg is dead, my back is hurting, and my throat is beginning to get very, very dry, so we will call it there. Everybody, thank you so much for watching. If you got to this point in the video, if you are able to, please do give it a like and subscribe if you're new to the channel. But until the next video, everybody,